So, first, thank you, Monica. I find myself in complete agreement with almost everything you said. But that's the problem with integrationists, is that they agree with everybody. I've decided to not say what I was planning to do, but I'll just go back very, very quickly to two things that I wanted to say originally, and then I'm going to give you some snippet from a different talk that I recently gave, or a workshop that I recently gave, but not in a workshop mode, because I think it'll get my ideas across better than anything else. But what I wanted to say is that schema therapy as an integration, as a way of doing an integration, is in some ways both ambitious and humble, that it's ambitious in trying to step into this chasm, I never know how to pronounce that word, that lies between the purest accounts of all these different approaches. It could be learning theory, it could be emotion-focused approaches, it could be drive models, it could be attachment-focused, and to find some commonality between them and attempt to build a conceptual and practical bridge between them. And that's ambitious, but it does it, I hope it does it with a sense of humility, recognizing that there are many, many valid ideas and tools which already exist within other approaches and are worth adopting or just flat out stealing. And that makes this theory and approach really keep expanding with this implicit trust that there are going to be more valid ideas that are worth learning and worth putting into our practice, and that we shouldn't be threatened by that. And consequently, as I think you might have experienced yesterday, schema therapy tends to feel pretty hospitable to clinicians and trainees from diverse backgrounds, and I think that was the critique, Stephen, that you were making, that it might be too seductive an approach. But I think that seductiveness doesn't actually have to be dangerous. They always say that, right? The drug pushers. It can be an adoptive new world rather than a native home, and you can stay a psychoanalyst doing schema therapy or a CBT therapist doing schema therapy. You'll always continue to hear people's original accent. One of my closest colleagues in schema therapy is a relational psychoanalysis person named Ofer Maurer, who has been very active in the Israeli relational community. And Ofer and I come from very different backgrounds, but we find ourselves working collaboratively quite well. And there's still differences in choices we might make in particular moments, but with a common language at least. And this issue of language, I think, is an important one. There was a conference a few years back when Paul Wachtel, who was mentioned I think a couple of times over the last couple of days, came to Israel. And in that conference, we talked a lot about languages. And my thought was that as a profession, not necessarily as schema therapists, but as a profession of people doing mental health, we need to come up with some sort of universal language, like Esperanto. Those of you who are familiar with that failed attempt at an international language. Come up with something that would allow people to quite easily converse across cultures and societies, and we need that language. I think schema therapy offers a particularly easy to learn language to start off, and it doesn't have to keep us from having more complex ideas. Languages keep developing, languages keep expanding. One question I do have, which what I did originally plan to talk about, was whether integration is something that should be taught from the get-go, or whether it should be something that is achieved only after you've, gotten indoctrinated in a particular approach and then rebelled against it and found that it wasn't good enough for you and went out and learned. And I think it can be taught pretty early on. So I've argued that in our master's program in clinical psychology, which is just a 2-year program, it's perfectly fine to teach this in year 1 and to have them try it out by year 2 in the program. Not as a single approach. I like that they're in dynamic courses. I like that they're in CBT courses and in family therapy and systemic courses. But I want them to already start having a model of integration. And since I'm here, it's schema therapy, but there are others out there that can offer, I think, almost as good, though not quite as good, a way of integrating. Over time, we'll have to see whether that's dangerous, whether training people, to be integrationist is sort of like breeding mules who are born through the sexual intercourse of a horse and a donkey, but then are sterile afterwards, and are we going to be creating sterile people who are unable to understand learning principles all the way to the end, or learn or understand emotion theory, or understand the unconscious, if there even is such a thing. No, there is. So these are actually pretty pressing matters, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to instead try to really quickly give you an illustration of what I'm working on these days that I think will give you a sense of how this kind of integrationist approach creates for flexibility in work. And this might make schema therapy less appealing to those of you who weren't familiar with it before. So that would be a good thing, right? Because I'm trying to make it seem as if it's actually not that great, which paradoxically is going to make you like it more. So the theme is of a workshop day that I did with this recently together with my colleague Ofer, was flexibility and modularity. And the take-home point we wanted to make is that schema therapy is a way of thinking and not necessarily a particular approach of working. You could work in all sorts of flexible ways if you adopt some of these ideas. And particularly the two ideas that I like the most of the ones that I talked about yesterday are the idea of modes or complexes or parts or cells or voices. Or there are 15 different names for the same thing, and that those are really, really useful to work with, but not necessarily just for the sake of creating integration or integrate itself, but also through differential work with these different modes. So that is idea number one. And the second is the idea of needs, which I think, despite Jonathan's protestation yesterday, I think is very similar to the idea of core fear. We'll have to argue about it. And I want to show you what it is that we're doing these days that takes advantage of these things, and in a way, and I didn't even know this, follows both Jung's footsteps in certain respects and Norcris's. So things that Monica just talked about. So schema therapy, I'm not going to talk about it again, is a transdiagnostic approach, blah, blah, blah. But we think of it as something that can be useful across an entire pendulum that we should be caring about as mental health professionals. A pendulum that goes all the way from deep work on personality, which was where Jeff Young started this kind of work, trying to apply Beck's model and failing to do so with people who have personality disorders, and then having to expand it and create this integrative approach. So that's where it starts. In the longer term end of things, typically schema therapy takes months or years to do. But I think that some of these ideas are useful for us as mental health clinicians, working all the way down to the level of very, very quick interventions, including ones that are automated, ones that are done without the person there. And I think that is something that the field is really crying for. There's now a lot of research in psychopathology, in personality research, and in psychotherapy research that I think leads to the same conclusion, which is that we need a model for thinking across all sorts of problems. On the psychopathological end of things, there's a big move away from the categorical view of the DSM with 300 or however many different diagnoses to approaches that recognize core principles or core mechanisms that work underneath. It could be the high top approach, which is a hierarchical way of thinking about personality and psychopathology. It could be the research, what's RDoC? Research diagnostic criteria, which tries to look at mechanisms. Those are both big movements in psychopathology research in the last 10 years that are very critical of the DSM in somewhat similar ways, and I think they call for trying to find what those core fears or core needs or core problems are. So let's see how that contributes to it. Secondly, there's the realization in personality psychology, even very, very academic work, that trait approaches like the Big Five are fine for certain things, but that they fail to capture those. There's a term Monica used that I really liked. These quantum units of personality. Personality is not just a dimension of extroversion. Personality is the experience of being a particular self in a particular moment. And that's finally something that personality researchers are getting at. There's this 1,600-page book that came out a year ago called The Handbook of Personality Dynamics and Processes, which is all very sophisticated stuff that I can't fully understand, honestly, but it's speaking to that issue. And finally, there's the realization, I think in a variety of areas, that we need to think transdiagnostically when we treat people, that similar principles might work across the diagnosis of anxiety or the diagnosis of depression. And so just a few examples of that here. So to do that, I think these two concepts that I talked about are useful. Tell me how much time I have, Yael? 5 minutes is fine, great. So the two concepts that I wanted to highlight from yesterday, two ideas, are the idea of modes or complexes. I like a particular quote about it by one of the most thoughtful people in the history of cognitive behavioral therapy, who then went on to be a Buddhist monk and left research, and that's John Teasdale. I think was at Cambridge for many years. And Teasdale says, we do not have one mind but many. At any one time, one of these minds may be dominant and can be thought of as the current mind in place. I love this quote because I think it is something that was recognized early on by a major thinker in cognitive therapy, and then sort of neglected for many years. And I'm happy to see other people coming back to it and trying to see how mode-based conceptualizations can be useful. So one thing we argue that we should be doing is coming up with mode-based conceptualizations, and we can do that for all sorts of things. Social anxiety was discussed a lot. So here's a model of social anxiety from Jennifer Wild and David Clark that was discussed here when we were talking about social anxiety, and they presented it as a flowchart that I completely agree with, but we can convert or we can translate this flowchart into a mode-based account of these things and think about how it is that safety behaviors are the action of a particular part of me, a particular self, or how anxiety or fear is the emotional output of a different part of the self, or how the thoughts, that's particularly critical and demeaning thoughts that I have, might be the words of a third kind of self. And that interplay between these selves and having people see that they have these different selves, working with those selves, is actually something that we find very useful. We find it useful to do it communicatively with the patient. Yeah? No, formulation is completely CBT. Yep, right. But I'm showing that CBT can be translated into schema therapy, just like dynamic therapy can be translated into schema therapy. And that once you do that, and once you draw these maps that try to say, here are the modes that I'm seeing, or maybe draw it collaboratively with the patient, you can get pretty far. I'll show you an example of that with a project that we're doing right now with test anxiety. So a relatively circumscribed condition that affects a ton of students and that is marked by severe distress and often professional and personal impairment in life. And we're trying to work in an approach that integrates very classic CBT, psychoeducation, and some exposure and cognitive restructuring with ideas from schema therapy that speak to the modes. It's a 6-session protocol in which we pay a lot of attention to the therapy relationship. We bring people into the lab. This is work done partly here and partly in Germany by colleagues of ours. And in this project, we videotape all the sessions, obviously, and give them a bunch of questionnaires, but we also measure their physiology and the therapist's physiology. And one of the interesting findings we've had is that we find that during the part of the session that's devoted to imagery work, which is a very emotional kind of approach or technique, when we find higher synchrony, physiological synchrony between therapist and client, we get better session outcome and better therapy outcome. So something about the relationship of being emotionally attuned therapists in the room in particular moments. It doesn't have to happen all the session, but it appears to be particularly relevant in the part of the session that is devoted to imagery, whether past focused or future focused, which was another topic we talked about here. That's when we get good results. So we're trying to do that, pay attention to immediacy. It's a 6-session therapy. First we tried to do it in 3 weeks, so 6 sessions crammed into 3 weeks. It was a little too tight. The results are okay, but they got better once we spread it out over the really long time of 6 weeks. I think of it as a cognitive behavioral therapy with a schema accent, or a schema-inspired cognitive therapy. I don't know. You have to tell me. You have to tell me. It's bound to fail, but it doesn't, is the thing. It sort of works. So that's one project we we're working on that tries to take an idea for schema therapy and apply it in a very modular way, in a short way, within what is otherwise pretty much cognitive behavioral theory. And the other one, given that 6 sessions seemed short, is we decided to go even shorter and go with single sessions and focus on the idea of needs, which was the other major thing that I was hoping you'd take away from. So we are, skip this part, but we're taking Carol Dweck's model, which I mentioned yesterday, and we're trying to think about what unmet need, or what frustrated need is causing a person the most distress. We didn't go with a very hard population here. So these are not traumatized people. These are folks with mild to moderate depression or anxiety that we screen to make sure that it's not too severe and that it would be ethical for us to meet them once. It's not automatized. We do think that the relationship matters. They meet with a therapist for 90 minutes, and the therapist gets in advance some information about which of these 7 needs, or 8 needs, depending on how you count them, that Dweck talks about, is empirically tied most strongly to distress for this particular person. We give them these annoying questionnaires for a month before they come into that single session. So there's a lot of collection of data, but that part doesn't take clinician time, which is in huge demand these days, as you probably all know. We're all flooded, and our clinics all have waiting lists. And this is an attempt to collect that information outside of the therapy and come into that single one-time session, which is sort of a lie because we have a session and then a checkup 2 weeks later by phone for 10 minutes. So you can think of it as a session and a half with the particular the particular need in mind. What was really fun about building this project, which is running right now, I don't have results for it yet, but I have just the joy of working on it. What was particularly interesting in it was the process of trying to think about needs which, as I said, are really central to schema therapy, but I think are central to the way we all think. Really think of them and say, who has the best response of all the different approaches out there? Who has the best response for people who need some help with their unmet need for predictability, or their unmet need for acceptance, or their unmet need for competence, or for trust, or autonomy and control, self-esteem, et cetera, et cetera. And this was about a year-long process that I did with colleagues at Berkeley and students here that made us go and read all sorts of clinical literature that I wasn't particularly well versed in, including acceptance and commitment therapy and interpersonal therapy and mindfulness and self-compassion therapy from Paul Gilbert and all sorts of approaches, and say, okay, this seems the most promising. In that one session that we have that's inspired by the theory of schema therapy, we're not going to do schema therapy. We're going to do IPT, or we're going to do ACT, or we're going to do behavioral therapy, because we think that that has the best evidence for working with this particular mechanism. I don't know if this works.
Eshkol, we must...
Yeah, I must. But here are the take-home points. Last slide.
Okay.
So if you adopt this, you could work, as I often do in my clinic, in my own private practice, over months or years with people, but it could also work in very, very targeted interventions that I think are worth doing for the sake of people's distress alleviation, which is the point that Eva was making a lot yesterday, but also for the sake of our responsibility as mental health system designers and providers. We gotta think about what are the effective mechanisms, and here's a way of thinking of it. That is all.
Thank you.